I extend a warm welcome to you viewers for another session on drama series, the 20th Century drama series that we have been taking up. This is in fact one of the last lectures on this series, and I have so far covered the American section of the drama series, and today's session therefore is going to be focused on the American drama per se, American theatre. And I have, over a period of these last few months, I have discussed with you the following dramatists: Eugene O'Neill, Clifford Odets, Thornton Wilder, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, and Neil Simon. We have discussed in these texts, along with these writers, one particular text that I find particularly interesting and as something symbolic of the age itself. So you find that Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into the Night, which was written around 1939 and between 41, although it was published later posthumously, and yet it was written during this period. We have also discussed Clifford Odets' Waiting for Lefty, which was published in 1935, Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth, published in 1942, Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie, which came out in 1944, Arthur Miller's The Death of a Salesman, 1949, and Neil Simon's The Odd Couple that came in 1965. Of course, The Odd Couple had a female version that came in also later. So our discussion around American theatre has been focused on these playwrights and these texts. Today, as a way of sum up, I wish to discuss the historical social background of American theatre and also discuss the kind of aesthetic that emerged around this time, at this particular time in America. Now, keeping these two tangents in place, we will begin with understanding how drama turned a new leaf in this particular period. Now, if you notice that drama in the 19th century in America wasn't at all known. It was only in the 20th century that American drama actually came out of its dark ages, so to speak. And it was the influence of playwrights such as Ibsen and Strindberg or the Moscow Art Theatre group that actually led a kind of a churning in American drama. Playwrights began to question why drama had become irrelevant in this age. In fact, playwrights such as Thornton Wilder and others wanted to investigate how theatre was not just inadequate in their age, of course it was, but also evasive. You see, that theatre wasn't trying to face the difficult questions of the time head on, and it tried to evade these questions. So not only was drama inadequate according to them, but it was also evasive because it was not touching its deeper potentialities, so to speak. And how is it that drama let itself become this kind of a minor art in the in this period, and how is it that it let itself be seen as a kind of an inconsequential diversion? So these were some of the questions that the playwrights faced at the time, that how is it that drama was made to become an inconsequential diversion? So people came when they to the theatre if they wanted to just entertain themselves, right? They came to the theatre not with the feeling that they were going to learn something or there was going to be something interesting that would be portrayed on the stage, but that they want a sort of a diversion from the kind of life that they were facing. So, the playwrights that I have taken up and I have mentioned here, all of them in their own way try to talk about a theatre that was aimed towards social criticism. And social criticism is at the center of each playwright's scheme of things, really speaking. It is something that they want to take hold of the audience and compel them really to look at their society in a very alert way and not, in fact, given to its kind of superficial pleasures that the society offered. So you see, it was a difficult sort of an enterprise for the playwrights to work on. And before these playwrights really could come in and could, and this was the kind of experimentation that was going on in drama at the time. So we need to also register that the early 20th century was also the movement or also the period of the little theaters in America. Very interestingly, there were these little theater companies that came up. Now we refer to it as the little theater movement, but it was this that drew attention to this kind of newness in theatre that was required. It brought to the fore this kind. So there was a sense of idealism among these little theatre companies. As the very title suggests, these were not commercial successes, right? We are not looking at big theatre groups. We are looking at little theatre companies which are almost like alternate theatres that are questioning the regime, the government, the policies, the age that people inhabit. And why is it that drama is not talking about any of that? Why is it that drama has ceased to speak about the problems of the day and has only moved in the direction of a kind of a flab or a kind of just superficial pleasures? So there is this kind of awareness that is being generated through these little theatre companies that have come up, and some of them include such as the Chicago Little Theatre, which came up in 1912. There was the Toy Theatre in Boston, which was again around the same time in 1912. The Provincetown Players, the Washington Square Players, and the Neighborhood Playhouse, among others. So these playhouses and these player groups were aiming to talk about things that were otherwise relegated to the margin, and they were not being discussed in the works. Now, this is the early 20th century, say from 1912 to about 1925, that this kind of staging experiments take shape, and drama is given a new form and a new leaf and a new lease of life. So freedom of expression is at the center of it. It is, as I said, idealistic in vain, because these companies, these idealists, most of these people who are a part, who have established these little theatre groups, are themselves actors and writers or producers, and they are trying to bring about a kind of, or present a theatre with the little that they have, the little resources that are available to them. And therefore they're also idealistic, because the idea of success and money has not as yet corrupted them, you can say, and therefore they can go on with their idealistic enterprise. So it began as a kind of an idealism among theatre goers and actors and playwrights who wish to talk about theatre as a space for experimentation, but also as a space for expression of human life, and that is something that both these things went hand in hand as far as the little theatre movement was concerned. So it was about purposeful theatre, and obviously it drew inspiration from Chekhov's play, for instance, that were presented in theatre. The Moscow Art Theatre actually came to America and presented its plays. Then they were influenced by, as I said, European theatre, and the Theatre Libre of Paris also had a great influence on this little theatre movement. And therefore their themes, because it was so cosmopolitan, because it tried to talk about, so there were adaptations of certain plays as well that happened around this time. So the themes were largely secular, and drama was in essence social. So this is the contribution of the little theatre movement, post which you find that there is this, this is till 1925, they've already set the stage for the new kind of drama to thrive. So as I said, when we discussed, for instance, the plays that I have earlier mentioned, then, we are looking at plays of the 1930s and the 40s. By the time you enter this age of drama, that is the 1930s and the 40s, drama has already become, a kind of a very important sort of medium through which ideas are floating in society. New ideas, for instance, are floating in society. So if you notice all the plays that we have taken up for discussion in the previous lectures, they all revolved around the period of the 1930s and 40s, and we know that this period was actually crucial for America. And why is that the case? I have, of course, discussed the historical background, but just to give you a brief sort of an overview of what was the life like, what was life like in America in the early 20th century, I would like you to look at some of the quotes here on your screen. And if you see your screens, you'll be able to see one such quote by Mary Elizabeth Lees, who actually voiced her concerns regarding this new kind of division that had occurred in society as early as in 1890, right? So as early as in 1890, there was a fierce struggle that we seldom speak about, that there was a fierce struggle between the rich and the poor. And Mary Elizabeth Lees was giving one of these lectures where, and she was obviously into propaganda and she was campaigning. She was a feminist and a political leader, so she was campaigning. In one such campaigns, when she was speaking to the ordinary people and the workers, she mentioned, she says this, and I quote, that the Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street and for Wall Street. That the common people are the slaves and monopoly is the master. The West and the South are bound and prostrate before the manufacturing East. Money rules. So this is what is the situation of America at that time, that the house is divided, the country is divided into two distinct groups of the rich and the poor, and the power is in the hands of the big businesses, that is the Wall Street. The Wall Street here refers to the stock market or the big businesses that are investing in the government as well. So the government is no more of the people or by the people, but it is a government that is clearly working for the monopoly groups, the big businesses, and the businesses which is the manufacturing East. Now it's interesting that the manufacturing sector gains a boost during this time because manufacturing grows, so obviously the working section also grows in society. But the point is that the whole culture of money is instilled in the mind of the people. The culture of money is what is the ideology behind this culture of money is what people are imbibing at the time. The new generation is imbibing. This is also the period and the growth of corporations, right? This is the period of big business. Beginning with the 20th century, capitalist kind of inventions took over. Scientific laboratories were in fact set up, and equipments were being produced and manufactured. Industries were actually now not producing goods of consumption. They were actually producing equipments that would further bring in goods, that would further produce equipment. So this kind of high scientific technical laboratories have been set up in America, and workers were required at this time. So there was no creativity involved because already the machine was doing all the work. So the workers were required to do this kind of rapid repetitive work. Now this rapid repetitive work is what probably if you think of Charlie Chaplin's The Modern Times, you'll be able to understand the rapid repetitive work. There is really nothing that you're supposed to do. There is this kind of mechanical life that the workers were leading, and very soon this mechanical life enters the home space where there are repetitive actions, repetitive movements, and how families behave. So the scene is not just limited to the factory or the industry, but this rapid repetitive work becomes a part of life, that you are always supposed to be in this kind of repetitive work. And whenever playwrights have tried to discuss it, they have almost always presented it as a kind of schizophrenia or a kind of a disease, or in some cases a kind of a traumatic experience for characters who have to undergo this kind of a process of rapid repetitive work. So if you take for instance the case of Tom in The Glass Menagerie, by Tennessee Williams, you will find that he utterly detests the work that he's supposed to do in the shoe maker's factory, and he utterly detests the fact that he has to do that repetitive work every day, right? If you think of Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman, then he's just repetitively driving the car for long distances, and he forgets whether he's driving this car or the car that he drove 20 years ago, and he's confused. It's almost like he's not even driving the car. So this repetitive action, so to speak, has a kind of a traumatic makes characters, tragic figures, and how they deal with this is something that, of course, each play works out its own pattern, but I just wanted to point out how the world outside enters the sphere of the domestic sphere and the personal sphere of characters and begin to show signs of, like alarming signs of some kind of a disease or some kind of a problem or a crisis. So this is what America looked like. Now, if you look at your screen once again, Woodrow Wilson, the President of United States, spoke of this phenomena about property, and this is what, in a way, you could say that it defines the model very clearly. And Woodrow Wilson says, and I quote to you all, "Men are cheap and machinery is dear," unquote. Now, men are cheap and machinery is dear. What does that really mean? It means that men are no more prized, and anything related to the human subject remains very much in the periphery, because machine now has taken center stage. And Woodrow Wilson went on to actually say that you can discard your man and you can replace that man. There are others ready to come into his place, but you can't do without the cost if you disregard or discard your machine. So discarding the machine is more difficult than discarding the man, and this is something that you already see. For instance, in Clifford Odets' Waiting for Lefty, the play, you find that how this kind of remember I spoke to you just now about the scientific discoveries taking place in laboratories, etc. So Clifford Odets, in his play Waiting for Lefty, actually shows us that how they are sitting together to create a kind of a bomb, right? And they are making machinery in laboratories, and how a technician is paid double or triple the amount only if he agrees to be part of this chemical weapons that are being created, that are being invented. So how scientific invention has also turned on its head, how scientific invention was supposed to make life better for human beings, and how it has turned upside down, and it is creating weapons to destroy the human race. So how it has turned on its head the entire enterprise of scientific progress and invention. So in a way, you find that all the ideals that America stood for, say in the 19th century, I mean, think of Walt Whitman and his great Song of America, right? All the ideals that America stood for, they're literally on their head, and they've turned upside down in the 20th century, because men who were supposed to carry the potential of progress are replaceable today, and scientific progress, which Walt Whitman, for instance, talks about railroads, about trains, about connecting human endeavor, turns into inventions of bombs and chemical weapons. So science itself is being used against human beings, and this, in a way, led to this kind of a larger there is this modernity, but what you see is that the ruthlessness of this entire culture, which you can very easily call the modern American consumer society. So this modern American consumer society brought in modernity, right? But it brought in this sense of complete disregard for human life, and this kind of ruthlessness that it practiced, this barbarity that came with that consumer society, because it did not keep the human potential and human work at the center. Rather, it tried to do away with the mass that happened, the mass of population. In fact, with mass consumption, there is also mass manipulation that takes place at the time. And what is that mass manipulation? You must have heard me speak about the American dream in my previous lectures, where the promise of the American dream was parceled to an entire generation who came up in the first or the second decades of at the time in America. So there was this promised American dream of wealth, right, and followed by its betrayal, which occurred soon after right in 1929, right, with the American Great Depression. Now, the promise and its betrayal, and mass manipulation that was occurring, and that is mass manipulation also refers to the kind of truth, the kind of illusion that is given to the people in the form of truth. And you will find that a lot of these writers here that we have discussed, they actually talk about the illusory nature of truth. For them, the truth is actually unavailable and distorted. So this is the distortion of truths that we are speaking of, that takes place at a larger level of hegemony, that takes shape in society, that is working on individuals, that manipulates the masses and makes them believe that there is going to be a lot for them to invest in, and they are going to have a very wealthy life. Now, look at another quote here from Leo Huberman, who's written this book, We the People, The Drama of America, right? And there, Huberman very interestingly and importantly notes, and I quote, "The America of 1932 was a vastly different place from the America of 1929. The hopes of the post-war decade had received a shattering blow. The high priests of private enterprise had become a public laughing stock. Where were the high wages, the chicken in every pot, the car in every garage of which they had boasted? The American dream of a never-ending and growing prosperity had become an exploded myth." Unquote. Look at this quote, and you will be able to get what I'm trying to say about American life, and why are we really spending so much time talking about this American dream and about Great Depression? Because this is the bedrock of all American drama at the time. If you do not understand the American dream and the kind of betrayal that occurred following it in the form of the Great Depression in 1929, why do I call it a betrayal and mass manipulation? It's because that this kind of a growth pattern that America undertook, this kind of escalating growth pattern, that this kind of ascendancy that it showed, it was bound to fall in that manner, because this kind of a wealth creation was not sustainable, really speaking, because it was happening with the very few. But the larger discourse, or the larger public opinion at the time was this, that there will be high wages for everybody, there will be a chicken in every pot, and there will be a car in every garage. But how would there be a car in every garage, really? Look at Willy Loman. He lives with that dream, the Willy Loman of Arthur Miller, right? And he lives with that dream in A Death of Salesman. But what happens? He had dreamt of that, and he's left, and he's on the verge of losing his job. He could never come out of the job that he had wanted. Now, what I'm really trying to say is that this dream is parcel to every American in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. They are made to believe that they need to work hard and become rich, and each one of us could have a rags to riches story. Now, it is true that America was in its phase of ascendancy, and that it was becoming a superior power at this time. You see, remember, America was able to keep itself out of the First World War, and this became a kind of a campaign also that was given around, that look, we kept ourselves out of the war. And most countries that required resources or weapons, America was in a position to actually sell it to them. So the market had already become international, because all the countries that were engaged in war required resources, required weapons, and America was producing them, right? So of course America was in that space of high, that they were able to do everything. But soon with 1929, when the Wall Street crashes, when the stock markets crash, America is unable to hold its own model of progress and development, because it is centered on the rich, on the monopoly. You see, what also happened in America was that earlier, when there were businesses, all the businesses came together and became corporates, right? They were not just one business, where initially they started out with competing one another, and then they realized, why compete when you can merge and become a bigger brand? So most of these big businesses combined and turned into corporate sectors, and corporations. Now, so which is why it also turns into a monopoly, and what we call monopoly capitalism. And America is one of the finest example of such a model of monopoly capitalism. But what we have not so far referred to is that how there were a series of protests and strikes that were taking place over the course of these decades, from 1880s and 90s. When I refer to Mary Elizabeth Lee's, we are referring to the late decades of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century. So every decade actually sees these kind of strikes, but they are crushed mercilessly and repressed. And when when 1929 occurs, it all explodes together, because it was already there, but it was being crushed. And now, with no jobs in place, with scarcity and resources, bleak resources, you find that this kind of repressed sort of anger of people actually comes to the fore and explodes. So the American dream, becomes a kind of an exploded myth of never-ending growth and prosperity is finally exploded, and the myth bursts. Yeah, the bubble bursts of this American dream. Now, this is therefore at the center of this entire, this is the larger historical and social background of this particular period in America, the early 20th century. So the first half of the 20th century really sees drama centered around this experience at a more personal level, at the more social level, in forms of strikes and protests taking place on streets, or at a more domestic level where families are involved, and how families are dealing with this kind of crisis, and how they're really making sense of their present time. Remember, there is also a kind of a past that they are looking at. So post 1929, as you know, Leo Wunderman said that the America of 1932 is vastly different from the America of 1929. What he really meant was that till 1929, the American dream was a possibility and a kind of a dream. But in 1932, when people are digging garbage bins to get some food, when there are long queues just to find shelter, when there is no job and the government has to literally ask people to come and break the roads and construct it again, then you know that America is in a very different space in 1930s. So all the generation that is living through this period has already a past behind them that boasted of this kind of wealth, right? And present which is uncertain and insecure, and a future that looks bleak to them. So it is in this space, it is in this sort of historical background and this framework that we need to place now the aesthetics of each playwright. And in the following lecture, I will be speaking about these the key concerns of all these playwrights that that we have discussed earlier, and to place them in this historical context and talk about the kind of aesthetics that emerges, or what you can call the American expression, or the the expression of art that takes place through the kind of enterprise that they take up individually. So with that, we come to the close of today's lecture, and I'll see you again as a wrap up of as a second part of this lecture series. Thank you.